Under a blood-red sunset in 1881, 12-year-old Jonah Maddox drags a dying Ute warrior through the burning canyons of Mesa Perdida, knowing one act of mercy could cost him everything, or give him a family he never dared dream of. He was the cursed orphan every frontier town spat on, carrying only a carved eagle bone from a father he watched burn. The warrior was the enemy that every preacher called a savage. Yet that night, their shared scars and the same Thunderbird symbol bound them tighter than blood. What happens when 200 painted warriors decide whether a white boy lives, dies, or becomes one of their own? Stay until the final drumbeat to discover how a single spark of courage turned an outcast into Crow of the Stone Wind. Hit subscribe, drop your state or country in the comments. We love seeing where the frontier still calls, and ride with us to the end. You won't leave the same. The sun bled out across Mesa Perdida like a gut-shot Mustang, painting the sandstone ribs of the canyon the color of old rust and fresh slaughter. 1881, Colorado-Utah border country, where the wind carried pine pitch, powder smoke, and the faint rot of dreams gone bad. Jonah Maddox moved through the ruins of a burned-out stage relay like a coyote pup that had learned too early that the world bites. 12 years old, ribs showing, shirt the color of alkali dust, and old blood. 2 winters ago, Clay Branson's riders had hit his family's survey wagons at Cottonwood Wash. Torches, screams, the stink of burning canvas and hair. Jonah remembered crawling out from under a dead horse at dawn, fingers locked around the only thing left of his father. A thumb-sized piece of eagle wing bone, carved with a thunderbird, spreading jagged wings, wrapped tight in rawhide, and hanging from a rawhide cord. Perdida's townsfolk called him the curse that walks. Shopkeepers chased him off with brooms. Preacher Harlan said he carried the mark of Cain. Kids threw rocks when he tried to beg crusts. So Jonah learned the back ways, slipping between corrals at dusk, licking condensed milk from busted tins, sleeping curled inside hay bales with a rusty skinning knife clutched to his chest. He spoke to no one. No one spoke to him. The Thunderbird bone bounced against his sternum every heartbeat, the only voice left that still called him son. That evening, the wind came down off the book cliffs, hard enough to scour paint off wagon sides. Jonah crouched behind the livery's broken wall, watching the last light die. Hunger gnawed like a trapped wolf. He needed something, anything, before full dark swallowed the town and the dogs came out. He eyed the butcher's scraps barrel, then the preacher's henhouse, calculating angles and escape routes the way other boys figured baseball scores. A raven croaked overhead, harsh as a hangman's laugh. Jonah glanced up and saw it wheel east, toward the red rock wilderness the Mexicans called Mesa Perdida, the lost tableland. Folks said nothing lived out there but heat stroke, rattlesnakes, and Ute ghosts still mad about the treaties. Jonah had no people left to fear losing, so the mesa never scared him. Sometimes he went there just to hear the wind without voices in it. He slipped past the last sagging fence post and followed a dry wash out of town. The Thunderbird bone tapped his breastbone with every step, steady as a war drum. Sagebrush snagged his patched trousers. The ground rose in broken steps of iron-red stone. Far behind him, the lamps of Perdida flickered on, one by one, as yellow eyes pretending civilization had ever taken root here. Half a mile out, the wind shifted and brought a new smell. Iron, thick and wet. Blood. Fresh. Jonah froze, hand dropping to the knife handle tucked in his rope belt. The raven cried again, closer now, circling something just over the next rise. He crept forward on hands and knees, belly to the dirt like a lizard. At the crest, he looked down into a shallow scoop of rock. A man lay sprawled there, chest heaving slowly, dark shirt soaked darker. Arrows bristled from his side like porcupine quills, snapped off short. A deep knife slash crossed his ribs, pumping steadily. Leather leggings, beaded moccasins, long black hair matted with blood and dust. Ute. Sky ridge band, from the cut of his quiver. Jonah's breath caught. Every sermon, every warning, every nightmare roared in his ears. Savage, murderer, scalp taker. Run. Tell the sheriff. Earn a hot meal and a pat on the head. But the dying man's hand twitched, fingers uncurling from a small rawhide pouch that had spilled open on the sand. Inside lay a piece of carved bone, pale against the red dirt. A thunderbird. Wings spread wide, exactly like the one around Jonah's own neck. The wind went suddenly still, as if the mesa itself held its breath. Jonah stared at the matching talismans, 2 thunderbirds separated by blood and hate, and 15 years of broken promises. Somewhere inside his chest, something cracked open like thin ice on a March river. He slid down the slope, boots skidding on loose scree, already reaching for the knife, not to kill, but to cut away the arrow shafts before the man bled out under a sky that didn't care whose side anyone was on. The knife flashed once in the dying light as Jonah sawed through the first arrow shaft just above the fletching. The barbed head stayed buried. Pulling it would rip the man open like a gutted trout. Blood pulsed hot over Jonah's knuckles, thick as pine sap. The Ute's breath rattled, shallow and wet, but his eyes cracked open, black as obsidian, fixed on the boy crouched over him. Jonah didn't speak. Words were for people who still had names worth saying. He sliced his own shirt tail into strips, wadded one against the worst wound, and cinched it tight with his belt. The warrior's body jerked, a low groan grinding out between clenched teeth. Jonah hooked skinny arms under the man's shoulders and dragged. 180 pounds of dead weight across broken shale felt like hauling a dead buffalo. Each yard left a dark smear on the red rock, bright as fresh paint. 50 yards deeper into the maze of fins and hoodoos, he found the slot he'd wintered in 2 years back. A knife-cut crevice barely wide enough for a boy, hidden behind a curtain of dead juniper. He wedged the warrior in sideways, head and shoulders first, then wriggled after him. Inside, the air cooled fast, smelling of bat guano and old campfire smoke. Jonah eased the man down onto a bed of wind-packed sand and went to work again. He snapped the remaining arrows flush with the skin, packed the holes with chewed sage leaves, the only medicine he knew, and bound everything with what was left of his shirt. The warrior's skin burned like a branding iron. Fever sweat mixed with blood until both ran the same color. Jonah sat back on his heels, chest heaving, and for the first time looked straight into the man's face. High cheekbones, hawk nose, 3 old scars tracking across one cheek like claw marks. A face carved for war. Yet the eyes held no hate, only the dull shine of a man counting the minutes left on his ticket. His right hand fumbled at his throat, found the spilled pouch, and closed around the carved Thunderbird bone. He lifted it toward Jonah, a question without sound. Jonah pulled his own amulet from under the rawhide cord. Side by side, the 2 bones were twins. Same wingspan, same lightning slash across the breast, same tiny drill hole for the cord. The warrior's eyes widened a fraction. His cracked lips shaped a word Jonah barely caught. "Father?" Jonah shook his head once, hard. No father, not anymore. The warrior's gaze drifted to the crevice mouth, where the last sliver of sun bled away, then closed. His breathing steadied into the slow rhythm of the half-dead. Night dropped like a trapdoor. Outside, coyotes began their evening argument. Jonah sat with his back to the rock wall, knife across his knees, listening to the stranger breathe and wondering what kind of fool risked a rope neck for a dying Indian. Hunger clawed again, but he ignored it. He had water, a mouthful left in his canteen, and that would have to do. Hours crawled. The warrior slipped in and out of fever dreams, muttering in Ute, sometimes in broken English. Names: Clay Branson, Crescent Basin, Sky Ridge. Each time Branson's name left the man's tongue, it carried the same poison Jonah tasted every night when he woke screaming from dreams of fire. Just before dawn, the bleeding slowed to an ooze. The warrior, Elk Runner, he called himself, when the fever loosened his tongue. Elk Runner opened his eyes clear for the first time and stared at the white boy who should have been his enemy. "You pulled death off me, boy," he rasped, voice raw as a file on iron. "Why?" Jonah met that stare without flinching. "Because Branson's still breathing," he said, "and I ain't done with him yet." Elk Runner studied him a long moment, then gave the smallest nod, the kind men exchange across a poker table when they both know the stakes just went sky high. Outside, the first pale blade of morning cut between the fins. Somewhere out on the mesa, hoofprints were already cooling, and men with rifles were waking up mean. Jonah tightened the last knot on the fresh bandage and felt the weight of the next few days settle on his shoulders like a loaded pack saddle. He had just bought himself an enemy's life. Now he had to figure out how to keep it. Dawn bled cold into the slot canyon, turning the rock walls the color of a fresh bruise. Jonah slipped out before the sun cleared the rim, moving like smoke over the broken ground. He knew every back trail into Perdida now. The dry arroyo behind the Chinese laundry, the loose board in the livery corral, the blind spot behind the assay office where the night soil wagon parked. By the time the town stirred, he had already lifted a twist of chewing tobacco laced with laudanum from the dock's saddlebag, a strip of salt pork from the butcher's smokehouse, and a half-empty bottle of trade whiskey that would clean a wound better than prayers ever did. Back in the crevice, Elk Runner was sitting up, back against the wall, sweat carving pale runnels through the dust on his face. The fever had broken sometime in the night, leaving him sharp-eyed and dangerous again. He took the whiskey without thanks, poured a slug over the arrow holes, and didn't flinch when the raw spirit hit raw meat. Then he drank what was left and handed the empty bottle back, like a man returning a borrowed knife. Days narrowed to a hard rhythm. Jonah hunted the edges of the mesa for prickly pear tuna and piñon nuts, laid false trails of blood from a pronghorn fawn he'd found gut-shot and dying, and scattered coyote scat over their real tracks. Elk Runner watched from the shadows, saying little, but every evening he corrected the boy's stance, the angle of his throw, the way he placed his weight on stone instead of sand. By the fourth sunset, Jonah could cross 50 yards of open shale without raising dust, and he could hear a horse a mile off by the way the ravens shut up. At night, the temperature dropped hard enough to crack iron. They lay close to the same small fire, shoulders almost touching, trading stories the way other men traded tobacco. Elk Runner spoke of the winter of '74, when Branson's riders torched 3 winter camps along the Green River, how his woman and boy burned inside their lodge while he was away hunting. He said the names once, soft as ash, then never again. Jonah answered with the smell of burning canvas at Cottonwood Wash, the way his little sister's hair caught like dry grass. Neither cried. Out here, tears froze before they hit the ground. On the 6th night, Elk Runner drew a map in the dirt with a mesquite twig. Crescent Basin, the hidden heart of Sky Ridge country, ringed by red walls no white man had ever ridden out of alive. "My people will come soon," he said. "They track better than wolves. When they find me, they find you." He looked at Jonah then, straight and unflinching. "You run now, boy, or you stand." Jonah stared at the fire until the coals blurred. Running was what he knew best. But running meant Branson kept breathing, kept burning, kept winning. He thought of the twin Thunderbirds hanging against two chests that had every reason to hate each other. He spat into the flames and watched as they hissed. "Stand," he said. Elk Runner's grin cut wide in the dark. He reached over, gripped Jonah's forearm hard enough to leave bruises, the warrior's handshake that sealed more than words ever could. Somewhere out in the dark, a nightbird called once, sharp as a warning. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of horses and oiled rifles. They were already closer than either man wanted. If the next minutes of this story are hitting you like a slug of raw whiskey, the kind that burns clean and true, do me a favor. Smash that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens when 200 Sky Ridge warriors decide the fate of one white boy. We're riding straight into the fire now, and trust me, you'll want to see how it ends. Elk Runner banked the fire with a boot heel until only a red eye remained. He checked the edge on Jonah's knife, handed it back hilt first, and settled into the shadows to wait. Jonah sat beside him, Thunderbird bone cold against his skin, listening to the mesa hold its breath. Hoofbeats rolled in just before moonset, a low thunder that shook dust from the crevice roof. Jonah came awake with Elk Runner's hand already clamped across his mouth. 20 riders, maybe more. Ponies snorting, rawhide creaking, the soft click of rifles sliding from scabbards. Sky Ridge had arrived. They poured into the slot like dark water, paint-smeared faces, crow-feather lances, eyes catching starlight like wet flint. The first warrior inside saw Jonah and snarled something that raised every lance at once. Elk Runner shoved himself upright, blood cracking fresh through the scabs, and barked a string of ute sharp enough to cut rope. Spears wavered, but did not drop. A scarred veteran with a Remington across his saddlebow spat questions. Elk Runner answered slowly, deliberately, pointing at the bandages, at the twin Thunderbird bones, now both hanging outside their shirts. The veteran's gaze flicked to Jonah's chest and narrowed. He spat again, this time on the ground between them, then jerked his chin. Ropes came out. Jonah's wrists were lashed behind his back with braided horsehair that bit like wire. They slung Elk Runner across a travois of willow poles and rawhide. Jonah walked in the middle of the column, barefoot on cold stone, prodded by lance butts whenever he slowed. The trail twisted upward, through country that had no name on any white man's map. Knife-edge ridges, pour-offs slick with frost, canyons so narrow the stars looked close enough to snag on a rifle barrel. Dawn found them descending into Crescent Basin, a hidden bowl ringed by blood-red walls 200 feet high. Smoke rose thin from 100 lodges clustered around a spring-fed creek. Children froze mid-game. Women reached for knives. Old men lifted bows that had killed buffalo and soldiers with equal ease. Silence fell heavy as a hanging rope. They halted in the center, before a fire pit ringed with painted buffalo skulls. Chief Black Canyon stepped out of the biggest lodge, tall, silver-braided, a scar running from left eye to jaw, like a lightning bolt frozen in flesh. His presence sucked the air from the basin. Warriors parted without being told. Elk Runner was lowered from the travois. He tried to stand, failed, and knelt instead. Words poured from him in Ute, fast and fierce. Jonah caught only fragments. Branson, ambush, the boy, Thunderbird. Black Canyon listened without expression, then turned those storm cloud eyes on Jonah. The chief spoke English like a man chewing nails. "White boy, you trespass on death ground. Speak your crime." Jonah's mouth was dust dry. 200 faces waited to watch him lie or die. He worked his wrists until the horsehair cut skin, then let the blood slick the knots enough to slip one hand free. He brought the Thunderbird bone into the firelight and laid it on the ground between him and the chief. Black Canyon stared, The scar on his face seemed to twitch. He knelt, picked up the carving with 2 fingers, and turned it over. Recognition hit him like a bullet. The basin heard his sharp intake of breath. "Winter of the long snow," he said, voice low enough that only the front rank heard. "My sister's family, starving. A white surveyor gave them the last of his corn and led them through the blizzard to the warm springs. He wore this mark." He looked up, eyes boring into Jonah. "You are his blood." A murmur rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water. Lances lowered a finger's breadth. Black Canyon rose. Mercy is not weakness, but debt must be proven. One test. He pointed east, where the canyon mouth narrowed to a slot barely wide enough for a horse. "Walk out alone before the sun clears the rim. If you bring soldiers, you die slowly. If you run clean, the debt is paid. If you return with empty hands and a true heart, we speak again." Jonah met the chief's stare and nodded once. The ropes fell away. Warriors stepped aside, making a silent corridor toward the dawn. He walked, bare feet on frost-sharp stone, blood still dripping from his wrists, Thunderbird bone swinging cold against his chest. Behind him, the basin held its breath. Ahead, the narrow slot glowed pink with the coming sun, and beyond that lay open desert. Perdida, and every reason he'd ever had to keep running. At the mouth, he paused, looked back once. Elk Runner, still on his knees, lifted one fist to his heart. Black Canyon stood motionless, scar livid in the new light. Jonah stepped into the slot and disappeared. The slot canyon spat Jonah out into the open like a spent cartridge. Heat rose off the sand in shimmering waves, but the sun had barely cleared the eastern rim when the first explosion cracked the morning wide open. A dull boom rolled across the mesa, followed by the sharp stink of coal oil and burning pine. Black smoke boiled up from the direction of Crescent Basin, thick as a stampede cloud. "Branson." Jonah ran, not away, back. Legs pumping over greasewood and lava rock, lungs burning, blood pounding in his ears like war drums. He crested the rim above the basin and saw hell already loose. 40 riders in dusters and slouch hats pouring through the eastern gap, torches flaring, rifles spitting fire. Women and children scrambled for the cliffs, while warriors sprinted to form a ragged line at the creek. Flames licked up 3 lodges before the first war cry answered. Jonah slid down a talus slope, boots skidding, scattering shale like buckshot. He knew Branson's play, same as Cottonwood Wash. Burn the camp, scatter the herd, grab the wounded leader, break the spine of the band. Elk Runner was the prize tonight. He hit the basin floor running low, snatched a burning brand from a fallen lodge, and vanished into the maze of side canyons Elk Runner had drilled into him. First trap, a deadfall of loose boulders perched above the narrow trail the mercenaries had to ride. Jonah jammed the torch under the key rock, heard the click of shifting stone, and sprinted on. Seconds later, the slope let go with a roar that buried 3 riders and half their horses under a ton of red thunder. Gunfire echoed everywhere now, sharp and flat, mixed with the deeper cough of Henry repeaters from the Ute line. Jonah ghosted along a dry wash, cut the lid ropes on Branson's remuda, slapped rumps until panicked horses thundered straight into their own ranks. Men cursed, wheeled, shot at shadows. He circled high, belly crawling along a ledge, and spotted the big man himself. Clay Branson, black beard, silver conchos flashing, swinging a Spencer carbine like a club. Branson bellowed orders, pointing toward the cluster of lodges where the wounded were being carried. Straight at Elk Runner. Jonah dropped from the ledge onto a mercenary's back, knife flashing once across the throat, grabbed the fallen Winchester, and levered around into the chamber. He had 5 shots, and no time for more. Below, Chief Black Canyon stood in the open, blood streaming from a graze on his temple, war club raised, 3 riders closing fast. One leveled a Colt at the chief's head. Jonah rose from the rocks like a hawk off a thermal. 20 yards, downhill run, straight at them. He fired from the hip, the slug smashing the shooter's forearm, spinning him off his horse in a spray of red mist. The second rider wheeled. Jonah worked the lever and put one through the horse's chest. Screaming animal and rider crashed into the third, buying Black Canyon the heartbeat he needed to bury his club in a skull. Branson saw him then. Recognition twisted the mercenary's face into something ugly. "The curse, boy!" he roared, swinging the Spencer toward Jonah. Elk Runner rose from behind an overturned travois, shirt soaked crimson again, but upright. He stepped between Jonah and the muzzle flash. The heavy slug took him high in the chest, punched him backward into Jonah's arms. That was the spark. The andirons blew at once, long, rising wail that froze every white man in his saddle. From every crack, every shadow, every pour-off in the red walls, Sky Ridge warriors poured out. 200 ghosts painted for war, silent as death, arrows already in flight. The basin became a killing box. Riders went down with shafts in throats and eyes. Horses screamed and fell. The air filled with the wet thunk of tomahawks and the flat crack of rifles, answered by nothing but more arrows. Branson tried to wheel his mount, but a lance took the horse through the neck, and he hit the ground hard. Before he could rise, Black Canyon was there, boot on his throat, scar livid in the firelight. Jonah knelt in the dust, cradling Elk Runner. Blood bubbled with every breath. The warrior's eyes found Jonah's, clear for the last time. With trembling fingers, he lifted the Thunderbird bone from his own neck and pressed it into Jonah's hand, closing the boy's fist around both carvings, now one. "Crow of the Stone Wind," he whispered, the name tasting like smoke and iron. Then he was gone. Moonlight silvered the basin, washing the blood black. The last mercenary crawled toward the canyon mouth and was dragged back by his hair. Silence fell, broken only by the low mourning chant rising from 200 throats. Chief Black Canyon walked through the smoke and stood over Jonah. He took the joined Thunderbirds from the boy's shaking hand, threaded them onto a new rawhide cord, and hung them around Jonah's neck. "From this night forth," he said, voice carrying to every corner of the basin, "you walk with us. Crow of the Stone Wind, son of Sky Ridge, son of 2 worlds." 200 warriors pressed fists to hearts in perfect unison, the sound like distant thunder rolling across the mesa. Jonah Maddox, the curse that walks, was no more. The smoke has cleared over Crescent Basin, and a boy who once had nothing now carries a name forged in fire. Crow of the Stone Wind. If this story of 2 Thunderbirds, 2 broken hearts, and 1 night that rewrote blood itself hit you square in the chest, drop a comment below. Tell me what it stirred up, rage, hope, or something you can't yet name. Where are you listening from? A city apartment? A ranch porch? Halfway across the world? Let us know. We ride these trails because of you. Until the next moon lights the mesa, keep your powder dry and your heart open. See you on the next ride, friends.